Welcome. You've arrived at this quiet moment, a pause in the hum of the modern world. As you settle in, let the noise of your day soften and fade. Feel your breath slow, your thoughts ease. Tonight we'll journey back in time, to medieval Europe, to a world before electricity, before radiators or double-glazed windows. Outside, winter winds sweep across the countryside. Inside, a small cottage flickers with the faint glow of firelight. The air smells of smoke and straw, and every sound feels close. The crackle of embers, the rustle of blankets, the soft breathing of those who share the room. Here, warmth was a daily act of care. Families huddled together for heat. Straw beds were layered with wool and fur. Stones were warmed by the hearth and wrapped to hold through the night. Every gesture, every habit, every small choice carried the wisdom of survival. Over the next while, we'll move gently through their world. We'll notice how homes were built to keep in heat, how people shared body warmth and simple comfort, and how even in the harshest cold, life continued, quiet, humble, enduring. So breathe deeply, let your imagination settle by the fire, and let the quiet story of medieval warmth unfold. The winter sun in medieval Europe was a pale, distant thing. By mid-afternoon, it was already losing its struggle against the encroaching darkness. The light that reached the frozen fields was thin and cold, offering little warmth to the peasants who worked there. They moved slowly, conserving energy, their breath visible in the frigid air. The ground beneath their feet was hard, sometimes frozen solid, sometimes hidden under a layer of snow that had fallen days or weeks before and never melted. Work in winter was different from the labour of other seasons. There were no crops to tend, no harvest to bring in. The fields lay fallow, resting under their blanket of snow. But there were still tasks. Fences needed mending, firewood had to be gathered, tools require repair, animals needed tending, though many of the larger livestock had been slaughtered in the autumn, when feeding them through the winter became impossible. The few that remained, a cow perhaps, or a pig, some chickens, were valuable and required care. As the light began to fade, the work had to stop. There was no choice in this. Darkness came early in winter, and working in the dark was dangerous and inefficient. A peasant could not afford to injure himself stumbling over frozen ground or mishandling a tool in the dim light. The day's labour ended not because the work was finished, but because the sun dictated it. The family would begin the walk back to their cottage. It was not usually far. Peasant homes were built close to the fields they worked, within the village or just outside it. The walk might take only a few minutes, but in the cold, every minute mattered. They moved with purpose, carrying whatever they had been working with. An axe, a bundle of sticks, a length of rope. Their clothing, worn all day, was already damp with sweat despite the cold, and the moisture would begin to chill them as they walked. Children, if they had been out helping, walked alongside their parents. Boys might carry smaller tools or kindling. Girls might hold the hand of a younger sibling. Everyone moved quietly. Conversation was minimal. The cold discouraged talk, and there was an understanding that the cottage, and the warmth it promised, was the goal. Everything else could wait. The landscape around them was simple and austere. Snow-covered fields stretched out in gentle undulations. Bare trees stood in small clusters, their branches black against the grey sky. There were no fences in the modern sense, no neat property lines. The medieval countryside was open, the fields divided by custom and agreement rather than physical barriers. Paths between the fields were well worn, trampled by countless feet over many seasons, but in winter they were often obscured by snow and had to be navigated by memory. Smoke was often the first sign of home. From a distance, the thin column rising from the cottage roof was a marker, a beacon of warmth in the cold expanse. It rose slowly, dispersing into the grey sky, and it meant the fire inside was still alive. Keeping the fire going all day, even when the family was out working, was important. Relighting a fire from scratch was possible, but it took time and effort. Flint and steel could produce a spark, but coaxing that spark into a flame required dry tinder, patience and skill. It was far easier to leave the fire smouldering under a layer of ash while the family was away, a banked ember that could be revived quickly upon their return. As they drew closer, the cottage came into sharper focus. It was a small structure, low to the ground, its walls a dull brownish grey, where the daub had been applied over the woven wood framework. The roof, thick with layered thatch, was darkened by smoke and age. There were no windows visible, or if there were, they were small and shuttered tight. The door was simple, wooden, often warped slightly from years of use and exposure to the elements. The moment of crossing the threshold was significant. Outside, the world was vast, cold and indifferent. Inside, the space was defined, enclosed and warm by comparison. The door was pulled open, and the family stepped through, one by one. Immediately the wind's constant presence diminished. The sound of it became muffled, a distant howl rather than an immediate assault. The door was pulled shut behind them, and the cottage embraced them. The cottage was dark. Even in daytime, little light entered. By evening, the interior was nearly black. The only glow came from the hearth, where a smouldering fire awaited revival. Shapes slowly emerged from the dimness, the rough walls, low beams, and simple furnishings. The fire was the centre of life. It burned in a shallow pit lined with stones or clay to protect the earthen floor. The ground around it was dark and hardened from years of heat. In the morning, ash was spread over the coals to preserve them through the day. Now someone, usually the father or eldest child, knelt to uncover the embers. Beneath the ash, they still glowed faintly. Kindling was added, and with a few steady breaths, the fire flared back to life. Light and warmth returned, though only near the hearth. Beyond it, the cold lingered. The cottage itself was plain. Its wattle-and-daub walls, woven wood coated with clay, straw and dung, were rough and required constant repair. The ceiling was low, the beams blackened by smoke. Above lay the thatched roof, thick and insulating, keeping out rain and slowing the loss of heat. There was no chimney. Smoke drifted upward, escaping through a small hole or the porous thatch filling the room with haze. Eyes stung and breathing was harsh, yet the smoke preserved the wood, deterred insects and kept pests away. Life adjusted to it. People stayed low where the air was clearer. Furniture was short, stools and benches close to the ground, and beds near the floor. The floor was bare earth, sometimes packed or covered with rushes or straw for warmth. Near the fire it was scorched red from heat. Cloaks and tunics, damp from the day, hung near the hearth to dry, carefully to avoid burning. Beneath them, people wore long linen shifts, softer and easier to clean than wool, though washing was rare in winter. Children dressed like smaller adults, the youngest were wrapped in wool or blankets. Footwear, if owned, was simple leather, often patched. Many went barefoot indoors, even in the cold. Gradually the warmth spread, though draughts slipped through cracks in the walls and around the ill-fitted door. Still, the fire held back the chill, and within the smoky glow the family found comfort from the wind outside. The cottage, for all its simplicity, was a carefully constructed shelter. Its design was shaped by the materials available and the knowledge passed down through generations. Every element of its construction served a purpose, and together, these elements created a structure that could withstand the forces of winter. The foundation of the cottage, if it could be called that, was minimal. In some cases, the wooden posts that formed the frame of the building were simply driven into the ground. In others, they might rest on flat stones to keep the wood from direct contact with the damp earth, which would cause it to rot more quickly. The floor, as mentioned, was usually packed to earth, sometimes slightly raised to help with drainage if the cottage was built in a low-lying area prone to flooding. The walls were the primary defence against the elements. The wattle-and-daub construction was effective because it combined flexibility with strength. The woven wattle framework could bend slightly without breaking, which was important in a structure that would shift and settle over time. The daub coating provided the insulation and weather resistance. The mixture of clay, soil, sand, straw and dung dried into a hard, dense material that blocked the wind and provided a degree of thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night. Maintaining the daub was an ongoing task. Over the course of a year, especially after a harsh winter, cracks would appear. Water could seep into these cracks, and if it froze, it would expand and make the cracks worse. Each spring or summer, the family would mix a new batch of daub and repair the damage, smoothing the mixture over the cracks with their hands or simple tools. This was messy work, but it was essential. A well-maintained wall could last for many years, but neglect would lead to rapid deterioration. The roof was equally important. Thatching was a skilled craft, and a good thatcher was valued in a medieval village. The process involved layering bundles of reeds or straw, each bundle tied and secured to the wooden framework of the roof. The layers overlapped, much like shingles on a modern roof, creating a surface that water would run off rather than penetrate. A well-thatched roof could last for decades if properly maintained, though it required periodic attention. Damaged sections had to be replaced, and the entire roof might need to be rethatched every 20 or 30 years. The thickness of the thatch was key to its insulating properties. A roof might be 2 or even 3 feet thick, creating a substantial barrier between the interior of the cottage and the outside air. The air trapped within the densely packed straw acted as insulation, much like modern fiberglass or foam insulation works. In winter, snow would often accumulate on the roof, adding another layer of insulation. Snow is an excellent insulator because it is mostly air trapped within ice crystals. A thick layer of snow on the roof actually helped to keep the cottage warmer, sealing any small gaps and preventing heat from escaping. Windows were vulnerable. Glass, as a building material, was extraordinarily expensive in the medieval period. It was produced by skilled craftsmen and used primarily in churches, where the large windows served both a functional and a symbolic purpose. For a peasant, glass was out of the question. Most peasant cottages had no windows at all. Light was admitted through the door when it was open, and that was sufficient during the day. At night, or in winter, when the door needed to be kept closed, the interior was lit only by the fire. In some cottages, there might be a small opening high in the wall, intended to let in a bit of light and allow smoke to escape. This opening could be closed with a wooden shutter when needed. The shutter might be secured with a simple peg or latch. To further block drafts, the opening could be stuffed with straw, cloth, or dried moss. Oiled cloth, which was somewhat translucent and more resistant to water than untreated fabric, might also be used to cover such openings, though this was a more expensive option. The door was another weak point. It was usually made of rough wooden planks, sometimes reinforced with crosspieces to prevent warping. It hung on simple iron hinges, if the family could afford them, or on leather straps. The door did not fit tightly in its frame. Gaps around the edges allowed cold air to enter, and on a windy night, one could feel the draft quite clearly. To combat this, a heavy blanket or a piece of thick fabric might be hung over the inside of the door. In some cases, an animal hide, perhaps from a cow or a deer, would be nailed or tied over the door, providing an additional barrier. Securing the cottage against the cold was a nightly ritual, one that became more important as winter deepened. After the family had returned and the fire had been revived, attention turned to sealing the space. Any cracks in the walls that had opened since the last repair were stuffed with whatever was at hand, straw rags, even clumps of moss gathered from the forest. The shutters, if there were any, were pulled tight and secured. The door was checked, and the blanket or hide covering it was adjusted to ensure it hung properly. This process was not dramatic. It was methodical and familiar, carried out with the efficiency born of repetition. Everyone in the family knew what needed to be done, and often no words were exchanged. A child might be sent to gather a handful of straw to plug a draft near the floor. An older child might check the shutters. The parents would oversee, making sure nothing was forgotten. The goal was simple: to transform the cottage into a sealed vessel, a container that would hold the warmth generated by the fire and the bodies within. The cottage, once sealed, felt different. The constant howl of the wind so present outside became a distant murmur. The drafts that had been noticeable when the door first opened were reduced, if not entirely eliminated. The air inside began to warm more quickly, and the family could begin to relax, knowing that the preparations were complete. The cottage was ready for the night. The door was more than just an entry point. It was a threshold between two worlds, the harsh, unforgiving cold of the winter night outside and the modest warmth and safety of the interior. Ensuring that this threshold was properly secured was one of the most important tasks of the evening. The door itself was simple. Wooden planks, often rough-hewn and uneven, were joined together to form a rectangular panel. The planks might be of different widths depending on what wood was available, and they were held together by crosspieces nailed or pegged across the back. The door was heavy, not because it was well crafted, but because the wood was thick and solid. This weight was actually an advantage, as it helped the door stay in place against the wind. The hinges were a potential point of failure. Iron hinges, if the family had them, were sturdy but could rust over time, especially in the damp conditions of a medieval winter. The strap hinges were cheaper and easier to make, but they could stretch or rot, causing the door to sag. A sagging door would not close properly, leaving gaps that let in the cold. Regular maintenance was necessary. A hinge might need to be tightened, or a new strap might need to be fitted. These repairs were usually done by the father or an older son, using whatever tools and materials were available. The door did not have a lock in the modern sense. Security was less of a concern for a peasant family, who owned little that was worth stealing. A simple wooden bar, dropped into brackets on the inside of the door, was usually sufficient to keep it closed. This bar could be lifted out when the family needed to leave, and it would be put back in place upon their return. The real challenge with the door was not keeping people out, but keeping the cold out. The gaps around the edges of the door, where it met the frame, were the problem. Even a small gap could let in a steady stream of cold air, and over the course of a long night, this would drain the warmth from the cottage. The solution was to cover the door from the inside. A thick woolen blanket was often used for this purpose. Wool was the fabric of choice for insulation in the medieval period. Excellent at trapping air and blocking drafts, a large blanket, perhaps one that had seen better days and was no longer suitable for use on the bed, would be hung over the door. It might be draped over a wooden rod or simply nailed or pegged directly to the door or the wall around the doorframe. The blanket needed to be heavy enough to stay in place and large enough to cover the door completely, extending beyond the frame on all sides to ensure that no gaps remained. If the family had more than one blanket to spare, multiple layers might be used. Each layer added to the insulating effect, and the air trapped between the layers provided additional protection. In some households, an animal hide would be used instead of, or in addition to, a blanket. A cow hide was particularly effective because it was large, thick, and relatively wind-resistant. A sheepskin, with the wool still attached, provided both insulation and a degree of water resistance. These hides were valuable, so they were used carefully and maintained as well as possible. They might be treated with fat or oil to keep the leather supple and to help repel moisture. The process of securing the door covering was straightforward but required attention to detail. The blanket or hide had to be positioned correctly, covering the entire door and the area around it. If it was being hung from a rod, the rod had to be secured firmly so it would not fall during the night. If it was being nailed or pegged, care had to be taken not to tear the fabric or leather. Once in place, the covering was adjusted as needed, pulling it tight in some areas, allowing it to drape in others, ensuring that it formed a complete barrier. The effect was immediate. The drafts that had been seeping in around the door diminished. The temperature near the door, which had been noticeably colder than the rest of the room, began to equalize. The family standing near the hearth could feel the difference. The cottage was becoming a sealed space, and the warmth from the fire was no longer being lost as quickly to the outside air. This was not a perfect seal. No matter how carefully the door was covered, some air would still find its way in. The cottage was not airtight, and that was actually important. A completely sealed space would have been dangerous, as the fire consumed oxygen and produced smoke and carbon monoxide. The small amount of air that continued to leak in through the various gaps in the walls and roof provided the necessary ventilation, allowing the fire to burn and preventing the build-up of harmful gases. The family did not understand the science of this, but generations of experience had taught them how to balance the need for warmth with the need for breathable air. At the centre of the single room, glowing like a captive sun, was the hearth. This was more than just a place for cooking. It was the gravitational centre of the peasant home, the unwavering source of light and, most critically, of life-sustaining warmth. Unlike the grand chimneyed fireplaces of a lord's manor, the peasant hearth was typically a simple open fire pit in the middle of the floor, sometimes lined with clay or stones. Its central location was deliberate and ingenious, allowing heat to radiate outwards in all directions, warming the entire living space, however inefficiently. The fuel for this fire was a constant concern. Peasants often had rites known as istova to gather firewood from the lord's forests. This usually entitled them to collect fallen branches, deadwood, or coppice timber, a sustainable system of woodland management that provided a steady supply of fuel. In areas where wood was scarce, dried animal dung or peat cut from bogs would be used instead. The fire was rarely a roaring blaze, which would consume precious fuel too quickly. Instead, it was carefully managed to smoulder through the day and night, a bed of hot embers that could be coaxed back to life in the morning. The greatest drawback of the central open hearth was the smoke. With no chimney, the smoke would rise, linger, and slowly find its way out through a small hole in the roof or through the porous thatch itself. The interior of the cottage would have been perpetually smoky, the rafters blackened with soot, and the air thick with the smell of burning wood. Archaeological excavations of medieval peasant homes often reveal floors where the central area is heat-reddened from the constant fire, and layers of soot impregnate the surrounding soil. This smoky environment had consequences for how people lived and slept. It is likely that peasants spent much of their time sitting or lying low to the ground, beneath the densest layer of smoke that would have accumulated near the ceiling. This is one reason why furniture was sparse and low. Simple stools, benches, and the low-lying beds themselves kept the family in the clearer, more breathable air. The smoke was a nuisance and a health hazard, contributing to respiratory and eye ailments, but it also had an unintended benefit. The constant fumigation helped to preserve the timber frame of the house from rot and insects, and it kept pests like flies and mosquitoes at bay during warmer months. As night fell, the family would gather around the embers. The final meal of the day, a warm, thick soup or pottage, would be eaten, its heat transferring to their bodies. The pot itself was a valuable item, made of iron, heavy and durable, likely passed down through generations. It hung over the fire from an iron tripod or from a hook attached to a beam, positioned to receive just the right amount of heat. The fire's light flickered across the rough walls, casting moving shadows that danced with each shift in the air. This moving illumination was warm in colour, orange and yellow with hints of red, and it gave the interior a certain intimacy despite the rough conditions. The crackling and popping of burning wood filled the cottage with familiar sounds, reassuring in their predictability. As the evening progressed and the family completed their small tasks by firelight, the fire would gradually be allowed to burn down. The larger pieces of wood would be consumed, breaking apart into smaller pieces and eventually into coals. The flames would diminish and the light would fade to a steady glow. This transition was intentional and deliberate, preparing the fire for the critical task that would come before sleep, banking for the night. The fire, once revived with fresh wood, transformed the cottage. Flames rose higher than during the day, when fuel was rationed, casting a warm light that replaced the vanished daylight outside. Firelight was never still. It flickered and danced, its glow shifting across the uneven daub walls and the soot-darkened beams above. Shadows moved constantly, lengthening, shrinking, disappearing as the fire breathed. The family gathered around the hearth in quiet order. The father tended the flames, the mother stirred the pot, and the children arranged themselves nearby, seeking warmth but keeping clear of danger. The youngest might cling to their mother's skirts. Older ones helped with small tasks or simply watched the flames. Even the family dog claimed its place near the heat, half asleep on the floor. The warmth was uneven. Too close to the fire, one's face burned while the back stayed cold. So everyone turned now and then, warming one side then the other, in an unconscious rhythm. The flickering light softened faces, making expressions fleeting and voices more important than looks. In that dim glow, conversation was quiet, intimate, accompanied by the fire's steady crackle and hiss. Within the fire's circle of light, the family felt enclosed and safe. Beyond it, the corners of the cottage dissolved into shadow, the tools, grain sacks, and walls fading from view. Outside those walls lay only cold and darkness, making the hearth a fragile island of warmth in a frozen world. As the evening waned, the fire was allowed to sink into coals. The bright flames faded to a dull, steady glow, conserving what little wood remained. Its slow quieting mirrored the family's own descent into rest. By night's end, both fire and household slept, each holding its warmth in reserve until morning. The pot hanging over the fire held the evening meal, and as the family gathered around the hearth, attention turned to food. Eating meant more than easing hunger. It helped warm the body for the cold night ahead. The pot was precious, made of iron and likely handed down through generations. Iron cookware was costly, so it was well cared for, kept clean and free of rust. It hung over the fire from a tripod or a hook attached to a beam, adjustable to control the heat. Inside was pottage, a staple of peasant life. A thick, porridge-like stew, made from whatever ingredients were available. Grains such as barley, oats or rye formed the base, simmered in water or broth made from bones or vegetable scraps. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, parsnips or onions were added, along with dried peas or beans for protein. Leafy greens such as cabbage or kale went in last, and dried herbs, parsley, thyme or sage, added flavour. Meat was rare. If available, it was often a scrap of salted pork, a bone, or a bit of fat for flavour. Fish, especially herring, was more common, dried or salted for storage. Salt itself was valuable and used sparingly, so most pottage tasted simple by modern standards. The stew simmered for hours, thickening as the ingredients broke down. By nightfall it was ready, hearty, warm and filling. The mother or eldest daughter ladled it into wooden bowls, one for each family member. These bowls, like their carved spoons, were prized possessions, wiped clean after each meal, but rarely washed in winter to save water. Bread, if available, accompanied the meal. Peasant bread was coarse and heavy, made from rye or barley rather than wheat. Usually stale, it was softened by dipping into the pottage. Meals were communal and quiet. The family sat close to the hearth, eating slowly, grateful for the warmth and sustenance. Conversation was minimal, food was too precious for distraction. The heat of the meal spread through their bodies, fueling them for the cold night ahead. Any leftovers were kept in the pot for the next day, nothing was wasted. Even scraps were saved or fed to animals. The simple meal filled the belly, provided warmth, and drew the family together, a small comfort in the unending rhythm of survival. After the meal, time remained before sleep. The fire burned low, its light dim but enough for simple evening work. These hours were for small necessary tasks that required little light or effort. Mending was common. Tools used during the day often needed repair. A cracked axe handle bound with leather, a loose rake head reattached. The father or eldest son worked near the fire, fixing what he could by touch and experience. New handles were carved, joints wrapped tight with cord, simple work, but vital for survival. Women spun wool, the essential fibre of medieval life. After cleaning and carding the wool to align its fibres, they spun it with a drop spindle, a stick weighted by a whirl. As the spindle turned, the fibres twisted into thread. It was repetitive, steady work that could be done by firelight, productive and calming at once. Clothing repairs were also routine. Tunics and blankets wore out quickly, and every hole or tear was mended with bone or wooden needles and hand-spun thread. The stitches were rough but practical. Children helped as they could, learning to card wool, sew seams or tie knots. These evening lessons passed down essential skills for adulthood. When no work was needed, the family sat together, speaking softly or telling stories. Storytelling filled the darkness where books could not. Tales of heroes, saints, and local legends taught morals, preserved history, and gave comfort. Songs were also common, simple melodies about work, faith, or daily life, sung together, building a sense of unity. There was no strict schedule. Work and talk faded naturally as the fire dimmed and fatigue set in. Tools were put away, half-finished tasks left for another night. The children, drowsy from warmth and full bellies, began to drift off by the hearth. Before bed, a few chores remained. The fire had to be banked safely, the door secured, and often the animals brought inside for the night. Not all animals spent the winter nights inside the peasant cottage, but some did. Which animals were brought in depended on their size, value, and vulnerability to the cold. Chickens, being small and useful for their eggs, were often taken inside. A young calf, not yet strong enough to endure the winter, might also be sheltered. In some cases, a pig, an important source of food and wealth, would share the space as well. Keeping animals indoors served two purposes: protection and warmth. It shielded them from cold and predators, while their body heat helped warm the cottage. A cow could raise the temperature of a small room by several degrees, and even smaller animals added to the effect. As night fell, the father or an older child would bring them in quickly to keep the heat from escaping. Chickens were easiest, carried by hand from their roost and placed in a basket or crate. Larger animals like calves or pigs needed coaxing or gentle guidance, and were positioned near the wall, close enough to share warmth, but out of the way. Their presence changed the cottage. There were new sounds: the cluck of chickens, the soft snort of a pig, the slow breathing of a calf. There were new smells too, strong, earthy, familiar to people who lived this way all their lives. To a modern nose it would seem unpleasant, but for a medieval family it simply meant life. There were inconveniences. Animals could stir or make noise at night, and waste had to be cleaned in the morning. Yet the trade-off was worth it. Their warmth and the security of knowing valuable livestock were safe outweighed the discomfort. By the time the animals settled, the cottage felt full and alive, family, fire, and beasts sharing one space, their warmth mingling beneath the low smoke-darkened roof. With the animals inside and the family gathered around the hearth, the cottage reached its fullest extent. The single room, which during the day might have seemed sparse and empty, was now packed with living beings. Every corner was occupied, every bit of floor space accounted for. This crowding was not accidental or unfortunate, it was deliberate, a strategy for survival that concentrated warmth and ensured that no heat was wasted. The family occupied the central area near the hearth. This was the warmest part of the cottage, and it was where they would remain until it was time to move to the bed. The fire, though lower now than it had been earlier in the evening, still provided light and warmth. Around it, the parents and children sat or stood engaged in their final evening tasks or simply resting. The animals occupied the periphery. Chickens, in their basket or crate, were tucked into a corner where they would be out of the way. A pig or calf would be positioned along one of the walls where it could settle down for the night without interfering with the family's movements. The animals, being creatures of habit, quickly adapted to this routine. After a few nights, they would know what was expected of them and would settle into their designated spots with minimal fuss. The sense of crowding was palpable. In the dim, flickering light of the fire, it was sometimes difficult to see clearly, and people and animals alike became indistinct shapes in the shadows. The air was thick, smoky from the fire, humid from the breath of so many living beings, and heavy with the mingled sense of wood smoke, animals, and unwashed human bodies. To a modern sensibility, the atmosphere would seem oppressive, even unpleasant, but to the peasants living in it, it was normal. This was what winter meant. This was how one survived. The crowding also meant noise. The cottage was never silent. The fire crackled and popped. The animals shifted and made their various sounds, clucking, grunting, breathing. The family members moved and spoke, though conversation was often quiet and intermittent as the evening wore on. Children might murmur to each other or ask a question of their parents. The mother might speak softly to the youngest child, soothing them as they grew sleepy. The father might make a comment about the fire or the weather, a simple observation that required no response. There was also the sound of breathing. With so many living creatures in such a small space, the sound of inhalation and exhalation became a constant underlying rhythm. It was a sound that signified life, the presence of others, the fact that the family was together and safe. In the darkness, when visual cues were limited, sound and touch became more important. A parent might reach out and touch a child's shoulder, a gentle reminder of presence and connection. A child might press close to a parent, seeking warmth and reassurance. The crowding extended to the physical experience of the space. Moving around the cottage required care. One had to step over or around sleeping animals, avoid the fire pit, navigate between the various pieces of furniture and stored items. There was no privacy, no personal space. Everyone was constantly aware of everyone else's presence. This could be comforting or stifling, depending on one's perspective, but it was unavoidable. The lack of privacy extended to all aspects of life. There was no separate room for sleeping, no door to close for a moment of solitude. Bodily functions had to be managed within the constraints of the shared space. A chamber pot, if the family had one, would be kept in a corner and used as needed. More commonly, one would simply go outside briefly, even in the cold and dark, to relieve oneself. This was another reason to minimise trips outside, as each opening of the door let in the cold and required the space to be warmed again. The cottage, in its crowded state, became a kind of living organism. The fire was its heart, pumping warmth through the space. The family and animals were its body, generating heat and sustaining each other. The walls and roof were its skin, holding everything together and protecting it from the external cold. This interdependence was not consciously articulated, but it was deeply understood. Everyone and everything in the cottage relied on everything else. The survival of one was tied to the survival of all. As the evening deepened, the activity within the cottage began to slow. Tasks were completed or set aside. The spinning wheel fell silent, the wool set down. The tool being mended was put away, the work finished as well as it could be by firelight. The children, who had been sitting or playing quietly, grew still. The youngest might already be asleep, curled up near the fire, while the older ones fought against their growing tiredness, reluctant to give in to sleep but unable to resist it much longer. The parents would exchange a glance, a wordless communication that it was time to bank the fire for the night, time to make the final checks of the cottage's defences against the cold, time to settle everyone into the bed and surrender to the long hours of darkness ahead. The evening was ending, and the night, with all its challenges and its quiet peace, was about to begin. With the door secured and the cottage as sealed as it could be, the family's attention turned to the last tasks before sleep. The fire, already burning lower, needed careful management. The animals required final attention, and the space itself needed one more check. Not a repetition of earlier sealing, but a final verification that everything was ready for the long night ahead. The father would make a circuit of the cottage, not searching for new gaps, but confirming that the preparations already made remained in place. A blanket hung over the door might have shifted slightly and need adjustment. A shutter might have loosened in the wind and require a firmer securing. This was less about discovering new problems and more about ensuring that the cottage's defences would hold through the hours of darkness. This final check had a psychological dimension as well. The act of walking the perimeter, of deliberately confirming that the family was protected, provided reassurance. In a world where so much was uncertain and beyond one's control, the weather, the harvest, the demands of the Lord, this small ritual of verification was something tangible, something within the family's power to manage. Children, if still awake, might be given small roles in these preparations. A child might be asked to check that the blanket covering the door reached all the way to the floor. Another might be tasked with making sure the animals had settled into their sleeping places. These tasks were simple, requiring no special skill, but they gave the children a sense of participation and responsibility. They were learning through practice that survival required attention to detail and that everyone in the family had a role to play. The cottage now stood ready. The door was covered, the shutters were secured, the animals were inside, the fire, the heart of everything, was prepared for banking. The space had been transformed from a permeable shelter into something approaching a sealed vessel, ready to hold and protect the warmth that the family would generate through the night. The mother might take a moment to survey the scene, her husband near the hearth, preparing to bank the fire, her children gathered close, drowsy but not yet asleep. The animals settled in their corners, the small dark space that was their home, now as prepared as it could be for another night. There was no dramatic moment, no sense of accomplishment to be celebrated. This was simply what needed to be done night after night, throughout the long winter. It was routine, but it was also essential. As the family prepared to move toward the bed, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The active phase of the evening, eating, working, preparing, was ending. The passive phase, sleeping, enduring, surviving, was about to begin. The fire would be banked, the light would dim almost to nothing, and the family would gather together in the one place where warmth could be created and maintained, their shared bed. With the cottage sealed against the cold, the family's attention turned to the final tasks of the evening. These were the last steps before sleep, and they followed a familiar pattern, repeated every night throughout the winter. The routine was comforting in its predictability, a series of small actions that signalled the approach of rest. The fire, which had been burning steadily through the evening, now needed to be managed carefully. It had already been allowed to burn down somewhat, the flames subsiding as the larger pieces of wood were consumed. What remained was a bed of glowing coals, interspersed with partially burned pieces of wood that would continue to smoulder for hours if properly tended. The goal was to preserve these coals through the night, maintaining them in a state where they could be easily revived in the morning without having to restart the fire from scratch. The father would typically handle this task, though an older son might be taught to do it as part of his preparation for eventually managing his own household. The process required judgment and experience. Too much ash and the fire would be smothered completely, extinguished rather than banked. Too little ash and the fire would continue to burn too actively, consuming the remaining fuel and leaving nothing for the morning. Using a simple tool, perhaps a flat piece of wood or a crude metal shovel, the person banking the fire would carefully scrape ash from the edges of the fire pit toward the centre, covering the glowing coals. The ash would be spread evenly, creating a layer perhaps an inch thick. Beneath this blanket, the coals would continue to glow faintly, their combustion slowed by the reduced oxygen supply, but not stopped entirely. The heat they produced would be minimal, but it would be enough to keep the very centre of the cottage from becoming as cold as the outside air. The appearance of the banked fire was distinctive. The bright glow of the coals would disappear beneath the grey ash, visible only as a faint orange shimmer if one looked closely. The light in the cottage would diminish significantly. Where there had been flickering flames casting moving shadows, there was now only a dull, uniform glow, barely enough to see by. The darkness would press in more closely, and the family would become indistinct shapes in the gloom. With the fire banked, the temperature in the cottage would begin to drop, the radiant heat that had been so noticeable near the hearth would fade. Within minutes, the family would start to feel the cold creeping back in. This was expected and unavoidable. The banked fire was not meant to keep the cottage warm through the night. No amount of wood could do that without constant tending. Instead, it was meant to preserve the means of creating warmth, to keep the fire alive in its dormant state so that it could be brought back to full life when needed. The family would begin to prepare themselves for sleep. For the children, this meant very little in the way of changing clothes. As discussed earlier, peasants did not have specialised nightwear. The children were already wearing their basic garments, linen underclothes that served as both day and night attire. If a child had shed their woolen outer tunic earlier in the evening to dry by the fire, they might put it back on now for extra warmth. More likely, they would simply proceed to bed as they were. Adults followed a similar pattern. The mother might remove her outer layers if they were particularly bulky or dirty, but she would keep her linen shift on. The father might do the same, shedding his woolen tunic but retaining his linen undergarments. In the coldest weather, however, they might keep everything on, accepting the added warmth of multiple layers over the slight inconvenience of sleeping in day clothes. Footwear received special attention. Feet were particularly vulnerable to cold, and frostbite was a real danger in winter. Those who had shoes or boots would typically remove them before bed. Leather footwear, especially if damp, could become uncomfortable and even damaging if worn all night. But the feet would not be left bare. Woolen socks, if the family had them, would be worn. These might be simple tubes of knitted or felted wool pulled on over the foot and lower leg. Alternatively, strips of wool cloth might be wrapped around the feet, secured with ties or simply tucked in upon themselves. For those without proper socks, other solutions existed. Feet might be wrapped in rags, multiple layers providing insulation. In the poorest households, dried grass or straw might be stuffed around the feet, creating a crude but somewhat effective barrier against the cold. These improvised solutions were uncomfortable and far from ideal, but they were better than nothing. Head coverings were also important. A significant amount of body heat is lost through the head, and keeping it covered helped retain warmth. Women typically wore linen coifs, close-fitting caps that covered the hair and tied under the chin. These would be kept on through the night. Men might wear similar caps, or they might use a simple cloth wrapped around the head. Children's heads would be covered as well with whatever small caps or cloths were available. The younger children would be prepared for bed by their mother. This might involve checking that their clothing was properly arranged, that no fabric was bunched uncomfortably, or likely to cause chafing during the night. A toddler might be soothed with a few quiet words or a gentle touch. An infant, if there was one, would likely be swaddled, wrapped tightly in cloth strips that restricted movement but provided warmth and a sense of security. As these preparations were completed, the family would begin to gather near the sleeping area. The bed, which had been waiting empty through the evening, was about to become the centre of the family's world for the next 10 or 12 hours. But before anyone could climb in, the bed itself needed to be prepared, the layers of bedding arranged to provide maximum warmth and comfort. The bed was not a piece of furniture in the way modern people understand the term. It was not designed for comfort or aesthetic appeal. Its sole purpose was functional, to provide a sleeping surface that was elevated from the cold floor and that could accommodate the entire family. The design varied depending on the family's resources, but the underlying principles were consistent across most peasant households. For the poorest families, the bed might be nothing more than a designated area on the floor. This area would be marked perhaps by a slight raised platform made of wooden planks laid directly on the earth, or even just by a thicker layer of straw or rushes that provided minimal cushioning. This was the most basic form of sleeping arrangement, offering little more than a symbolic separation from the floor itself. More commonly, the bed would have some sort of frame. This was typically a simple wooden structure built low to the ground, perhaps a foot or 18 inches high. The frame consisted of 4 corner posts connected by rails, creating a rectangular platform. Across this platform, ropes would be strung in a crisscross pattern, creating a flexible support system. These ropes were usually made of hemp or other plant fibres, twisted together for strength. The rope support system required periodic adjustment. Over time, with the weight of the sleepers, the ropes would stretch and sag, reducing their effectiveness. Tightening the bed was a regular maintenance task, involving untying the ropes from their anchor points on the frame and retying them with more tension. This is where the phrase "sleep tight" may have originated, though the etymology is debated. Regardless, the concept was real. A bed with properly tensioned ropes provided better support and was more comfortable than one with sagging loose ropes. On top of the rope support sat the mattress, known as the palliasse. This was essentially a large sack, sewn from coarse cloth, usually canvas made from hemp or flax. The sack would be stuffed with whatever filling material was available and affordable. Straw was by far the most common filling. It was abundant, free for the gathering, and reasonably effective as insulation and cushioning when fresh. The straw used for filling was typically wheat or rye straw, the stalks left over after the grain had been threshed. This straw was dry and relatively clean, though it would contain dust and small debris. A palliasse might hold several armfuls of straw stuffed in tightly to create a reasonably firm surface. The opening through which the straw was inserted would then be sewn or tied shut. The problem with straw was that it broke down over time. The stalks would be crushed by the weight of the sleepers, fragmenting into smaller and smaller pieces. The mattress would become lumpy and uneven, and the broken straw would work its way through the weave of the cloth, poking and scratching the sleepers. After several months, the straw would need to be emptied out and replaced with fresh material. This was typically done in the late summer or early autumn, after the harvest when fresh straw was plentiful. Some families, if they could manage it, used other materials for stuffing. Dried leaves gathered in the autumn could serve as mattress filling. Heather, cut from the moors, was another option. Wool, if the family could spare it, made an excellent filling, softer and more resilient than straw, though more expensive and more likely to be used for other purposes. The poorest families might stuff their palliasses with rags, old clothing torn into strips, creating a mattress that was lumpy and uneven but still better than sleeping directly on wooden slats or earth. The palliasse rested on the rope support, and on top of the palliasse would be additional layers of bedding. The first layer might be a sheet, though this was something of a luxury. Linen sheets were expensive and many peasant families did not have them. If they did, the sheet would be coarse and rough, made from homespun flax fibre, but it would provide a barrier between the sleeper and the scratchy straw mattress. More commonly, the family would place a woolen blanket or a piece of rough woolen cloth directly on top of the palliasse. This served the same purpose as a sheet, protecting the sleepers from the straw while providing a first layer of insulation. The cloth would be worn and often patched, repaired repeatedly over the years, but still serviceable. The location of the bed within the cottage was strategic. It was typically positioned against one of the walls, taking advantage of the wall as a barrier against drafts on at least one side. The bed would be placed as far from the door as possible, since the door was a major source of cold air. At the same time, it could not be too far from the hearth, as the residual warmth from the banked fire would contribute to the overall temperature of the sleeping area. In some cottages, the bed might be partially enclosed. A simple wooden partition might extend from the wall, creating a small alcove that provided additional draft protection and a sense of privacy, however minimal. This partition might only be 3 or 4 feet high, enough to block some air movement, but not enough to create a completely separate space. In other cottages, particularly the smallest and simplest ones, the bed would simply occupy one corner or one wall, with no partition at all. As the family approached the bed in the dim light of the banked fire, the process of settling for the night required coordination. This was not merely finding a comfortable spot. It was the deliberate construction of a survival system, bodies and blankets arranged to create and trap warmth. The parents would climb into the bed first, the father positioning himself toward the outer edge, the mother beside him. Between them, or tucked against the mother's far side, would go the youngest child, an infant if there was one, or the smallest toddler. This central positioning was not arbitrary. The youngest, with the least body mass and the highest vulnerability to cold, needed the most protection. Surrounded by the larger bodies, the child would benefit from heat radiating from both sides. The older children would follow, arranging themselves in an order that had likely been established through practice. A child of 7 or 8 might climb in next to the father. Another might position themselves at the mother's other side. If the family was large, children might need to lie at alternating angles to fit, one child's head near another's feet, maximising the use of the sleeping surface. The fit was intimate by necessity, bodies pressed against one another along their length, shoulders touching, legs overlapping slightly. Arms would be tucked close to the body or draped over a sibling. The arrangement created a continuous surface of warmth, with no cold gaps between sleepers. This physical closeness which would be considered intrusive in later centuries, was simply the reality of winter survival. Once everyone was positioned, the critical work of covering began. The first blanket, rough wool, heavy and slightly scratchy, would be pulled up from where it lay folded at the foot of the bed. Someone, usually the mother or father, would spread it over the family, ensuring it covered everyone from shoulders to feet. The blanket would be tucked along the sides, pushed down between the edge of the mattress and the bed frame to prevent cold air from seeping in. The second blanket would follow, layered on top of the first. Each additional layer trapped air between the fabrics, and this trapped air was the key to insulation. The wool fibres themselves, with their natural crimp and structure, created countless tiny air pockets within each blanket. Stack multiple blankets, and the insulating effect multiplied. The third layer, if the family had it, would be different in character. This was the hide, sheepskin with its wool still attached, or cowhide, or a patchwork of smaller furs stitched together. This layer was heavier than the wool blankets, and its purpose was twofold. It added substantial warmth, but more importantly, it sealed the system. The hide was less permeable to air than woven wool, creating a barrier that trapped the warm, humid air rising from the family's bodies. The hide would be spread carefully, pulled up to cover the family completely. In moderate cold, it might be drawn up to shoulder level, leaving heads exposed for easier breathing. In bitter cold, it might be pulled up further, to the chin or even over the tops of heads, leaving only small breathing spaces. This complete enclosure created a tent-like space beneath the covers, a microclimate separate from the frigid cottage air. The weight of all these layers was considerable, perhaps 20 or 30 pounds of wool and hide pressing down on the sleepers. For small children, this weight could feel overwhelming at first, but the pressure served a purpose. It compressed the layers, reducing air movement and improving insulation. It also provided a sense of being held, of being secure, which helped calm restless children and encourage sleep. The edges and corners required particular attention. At the foot of the bed, the coverings needed to extend far enough to protect everyone's feet, the extremities most vulnerable to cold. The bottom edges would be tucked under the mattress or under the sleepers themselves, creating a seal that prevented cold air from creeping up from below. Along the sides, wherever the bedding met the edge of the sleeping surface, the same tucking process was repeated. Every potential gap was a point of heat loss, and the family's warmth would literally leak away if these gaps were not addressed. The person doing the tucking, usually a parent, would work methodically around the bed's perimeter, pressing the fabric down firmly, ensuring a continuous seal. This layering and tucking was not done in silence. There would be quiet exchanges, a parent asking a child if they were covered, a child saying they were cold, and adjustment being made. The process took several minutes, and during that time the family was still exposed to the cottage's cold air. But once the final tuck was made and everyone settled into stillness, the warming would begin. The first sensation was not warmth, but simply less cold. The immediate assault of the frigid air stopped. Then gradually, as the family's collective body heat began to accumulate in the enclosed space, actual warmth developed. It started nearest the skin, where body heat transferred directly to the innermost layer of fabric. That fabric warmed and held its heat. The warmth spread outward through the successive layers, moving slowly but steadily. Within 5 or 10 minutes, the space beneath the covers would be noticeably warmer than the cottage air. Within 15 or 20 minutes, it would be genuinely warm, perhaps 15 or 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding room. This was the microclimate, the pocket of heated air that would sustain the family through the night. It was created not by any external heat source, but by their own bodies, working collectively, their individual metabolisms combining to produce enough warmth for all. The final moments before sleep were marked by small adjustments and the last efforts to maximize warmth. The blankets and hides, once spread over the family, needed to be arranged carefully to ensure that no gaps remained through which warmth could escape or cold air could enter. This was a process that required attention, and usually the parents would take the lead, though older children might help. The edges of the blankets were the first concern. Where the blankets met the sides of the bed, there was always a risk that they would not reach all the way to the edge of the sleeping surface, leaving a gap through which cold air could seep in. To prevent this, the blankets would be tucked in along the sides, pushed down between the edge of the palliasse and the bed frame. This created a seal, holding the warm air in and the cold air out. At the foot of the bed, the blankets needed similar attention. feet being at the extremity of the body and having less blood flow than the core, were particularly vulnerable to cold. If the blankets did not cover the feet completely, they could become dangerously cold during the night. The person arranging the bedding, usually the mother or father, would make sure the blankets extended far enough down the bed to cover everyone's feet, and they would tuck the ends of the blankets under the mattress or under the sleepers themselves to hold them in place. The top of the bed, where heads rested, also required attention. In moderately cold weather, the blankets might be pulled up to shoulder level, leaving the heads exposed. This was more comfortable, as it allowed easier breathing and prevented the air beneath the blankets from becoming too stuffy. But in truly bitter cold, even heads needed to be covered, and the top blanket or hide might be pulled up higher to the level of the chin, or even over the tops of the heads, creating a breathing hole but otherwise enclosing the entire family in the bedding. This complete enclosure created a microclimate beneath the covers. The air inside this space would be warmed by the family's body heat and made humid by their breath and perspiration. Within a relatively short time, perhaps 20 or 30 minutes, the temperature beneath the blankets could be significantly warmer than the temperature in the cottage outside the bed. This warm pocket of air was the key to surviving the night. It was constantly refreshed by the heat generated by the family's metabolism, and it was held in place by the layers of wool and hide that acted as insulation. The weight of the bedding was noticeable. Multiple woolen blankets, plus a heavy hide or fur on top, created a substantial weight pressing down on the sleepers. This weight had both advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, it could feel oppressive, particularly for smaller children who might struggle to move or shift position once covered. On the other hand, the weight itself contributed to warmth by compressing the layers and reducing air movement, and it provided a sense of security and groundedness that many people found comforting. The family would lie still as the final adjustments were made. Moving too much would disturb the carefully arranged blankets and let in cold air, so once settled, everyone tried to remain relatively motionless. This stillness was not just practical, it was also a psychological shift, a recognition that the active part of the day was over and that rest was now the priority. Breathing beneath the covers required some adjustment. The air was warmer and more humid than the air outside the blankets, and it had a distinct quality, a mixture of the smell of wool, the smell of bodies, and the faint smell of straw from the mattress. To a modern person this might seem unpleasant, but to a medieval peasant it was simply the smell of night, of home, of family. It was familiar and therefore neutral, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, just present. The arrangement of bodies also affected how heat was distributed and retained. Those in the middle of the family huddle were warmest, benefiting from the body heat of people on either side of them. Those on the edges were cooler, as they had empty space and therefore cold air on one side. To compensate, the people on the edges might press closer to those in the middle, or they might curl up more tightly, reducing their surface area and conserving heat. Parents were acutely aware of the comfort and warmth of their children. A mother might reach over to check that a child's feet were covered, or to pull a blanket higher if she felt a draft. A father might shift his position slightly to share more of his body heat with a child beside him. These small acts of care continued even as sleep approached, instinctive responses rooted in the parental drive to protect and provide for one's offspring. The youngest children would typically fall asleep first. Their smaller bodies tired more quickly, and the warmth and darkness beneath the blankets were powerfully soporific. They would grow still, their breathing deepening and becoming more regular. An infant, if present, might nurse one last time before sleep, drawing comfort and nutrition from the mother before settling into its own rest. Older children would take longer to fall asleep, but they too would eventually succumb. The day had been long and physically demanding, and their bodies craved rest. They might lie awake for a while, listening to the sounds of the cottage, the wind outside, the occasional shift or grunt from one of the animals, the breathing of their siblings, but eventually their eyes would close and consciousness would slip away. The parents were often the last to fall asleep. They carried the responsibility for the family's welfare, and even in rest they remained partially alert, ready to respond if needed. A child might wake and need attention. An animal might become restless. The fire might need checking, though this was rare once it had been properly banked. But eventually even the parents would relax into sleep, their bodies demanding rest after the day's labour. As sleep took hold, the family's collective breathing would synchronise to some degree, creating a rhythm that filled the small space beneath the blankets. This rhythm, the rise and fall of chests, the gentle sound of inhalation and exhalation, was the sound of life continuing through the darkness, of survival being enacted breath by breath. The cottage, dark and cold outside the cocoon of the bed, held this small pocket of warmth and life, sustaining it through the long winter night. The transformation beneath the blankets was gradual but profound. What began as a desperate huddling against the cold became, within the span of half an hour, something approaching comfort. The family's bodies, which had been working hard to maintain core temperature in the cold cottage, could now relax somewhat. The external environment, though not warm by any objective measure, was no longer hostile. Children felt this change most acutely. Their smaller bodies, which lost heat more rapidly than adult bodies, had been quietly suffering in the cold cottage despite their proximity to the fire. Now, pressed between siblings or parents, wrapped in layers of wool, they began to warm from the outside in. Fingers and toes, which might have been numb or painful, began to tingle as circulation improved. The tingling was briefly uncomfortable, but it signalled returning warmth, and children learned early to recognise it as a positive sign. Their parents, generating more heat due to their larger mass, felt the warmth differently. They had been cold, certainly, but their greater reserves allowed them to endure the cold cottage with less immediate distress. For them, the bed's warmth was less about relief and more about the ability to stop fighting. Their bodies could cease the constant, energy-intensive work of maintaining temperature against a hostile environment. Muscles that had been slightly tensed against the cold could relax. Breathing, which had been somewhat shallow in the cold air, could deepen. The air beneath the covers took on a distinctive quality. It was not just warmer, but also more humid. Each breath released moisture, water vapour from the lungs, and beneath the relatively sealed covering of blankets and hide, this moisture accumulated. The humidity level rose steadily, creating air that felt warmer and softer than the dry, cold air of the cottage. This humid warmth was soothing to airways that had been breathing cold, harsh air all day. The psychological effect of this warming was significant. Throughout the day, cold had been a constant presence, a chronic stressor that could never be fully escaped. Even near the fire, one side of the body would be warm while the other remained cold. Extremities were always vulnerable. There was never a moment of being truly, completely warm. But now, beneath the covers, with the family gathered together, genuine warmth was achieved. The body's stress response could finally stand down. This sense of safety and warmth triggered the release of sleep. Children who had been holding themselves awake through sheer will, uncomfortable in the cold cottage, now surrendered rapidly. The youngest might fall asleep within minutes of the warmth taking hold, their breathing shifting from the irregular pattern of wakefulness to the deep, regular rhythm of childhood sleep. Their small bodies, finally comfortable, demanded rest, and there was no reason left to resist. Older children took longer, but they too found sleep, approaching. The warmth removed the barrier that cold had created. Where cold had kept them alert and uncomfortable, warmth allowed drowsiness to develop. Their thoughts, which might have been sharp and active while they were cold, began to blur and drift. The events of the day replayed in fragmentary form. Conversations they had heard merged with imagination. The boundary between thought and dream became indistinct, and then they were asleep, often without realizing the transition had occurred. The parents remained awake longest, but even they felt the pull of sleep growing stronger. The warmth, combined with the exhaustion of a day's labour, created powerful incentive to rest. The mother, lying beside her youngest child, might listen to the child's breathing deepen and slow, a sound that was deeply reassuring. The father, positioned on the outer edge of the family cluster, might make one final mental inventory. Were all the children accounted for? Was everything secure? Could he allow himself to rest? And gradually, inevitably, sleep claimed them all. The cottage fell into the deep quiet of a sleeping household. The only movements were the small, unconscious adjustments that sleepers make. A slight shift of position, a hand moving to pull a blanket higher, a child turning in sleep. The only sounds were breathing and the occasional external noise of wind or animals. The family, warm and secure in their cocoon of wool and hide, rested. While consciousness faded and the family slept, their bodies continued the work of survival. The warmth they had created beneath the blankets was not static. It was a dynamic system, constantly maintained by metabolic processes that never ceased, even in the deepest sleep. Each body was a furnace burning the calories consumed at the evening meal to produce heat. The metabolic rate slowed during sleep, but it did not stop. The heart continued to pump blood, carrying warmth from the body's core to the extremities. The liver, the largest internal organ, generated significant heat as it processed nutrients and performed its countless chemical functions. The brain, though at rest in terms of conscious thought, remained metabolically active, maintaining the neural patterns that constituted sleep itself. This metabolic heat production was not evenly distributed. The core of the body, the torso and head, generated the most heat and maintained the highest temperature. The extremities, arms and especially legs, hands and especially feet, received less blood flow during sleep and consequently stayed cooler. This was an evolved survival mechanism, allowing the body to prioritize the organs essential for life, even if it meant some discomfort or even minor damage to the extremities. The blankets and hides worked not by generating heat but by slowing its loss. Heat moved from warmer areas to cooler areas through several mechanisms. Conduction transferred heat through direct contact, from skin to fabric, from fabric to fabric. Convection would have carried heat away if air had been allowed to move freely, but the multiple layers of bedding trapped air in place, preventing convective heat loss. Radiation would have carried heat away to the cold cottage air and walls, but the layers of wool and the final hide barrier reflected much of this radiated heat back toward the bodies beneath. The system was imperfect. Heat did escape slowly but continuously throughout the night. The outer surface of the hide, exposed to the cottage's cold air, would cool to nearly the same temperature as its surroundings. The bottom layer, pressed against the straw mattress and the wooden slats beneath, would conduct some heat downward into the bed frame and eventually into the cold floor. But these losses were slow enough that the family's continuous heat production could replace them, maintaining the microclimate at a livable temperature. As the night progressed and the cottage grew colder, the banked fire producing less and less heat, the contrast between the bed's interior and the cottage's interior became more pronounced. By the deepest hours of the night, the temperature outside the blankets might drop to near freezing or even slightly below. Inside the blankets, it might remain at 50 or 55 degrees, perhaps even warmer near the centre where bodies were most densely packed. This 15 or 20 degree difference was the margin of survival. The humidity beneath the covers played a crucial role in this thermal balance. Water vapour from breathing and from slight perspiration accumulated in the enclosed space. This humid air felt warmer than dry air at the same temperature because it conducted heat more efficiently to the skin. It also prevented the evaporative cooling that would have occurred if the air had been dry. The family's skin remained slightly moist, and this moisture was held in place by the humid air, rather than evaporating and carrying away heat. The wool of the blankets had a special relationship with this moisture. Wool fibres can absorb up to 30% of their weight in water without feeling wet to the touch. As the humid air beneath the covers came into contact with the wool, the fibres absorbed some of the moisture. This absorption released a small amount of heat, the heat of absorption, a thermodynamic effect. More importantly, the absorbed moisture did not condense into liquid water that would have felt clammy and cold against the skin. The wool held the moisture in a form that was invisible and created no discomfort. The family's bodies also adjusted their own thermal regulation based on the environment. In the warmth beneath the blankets, blood vessels near the skin would dilate slightly, allowing more blood flow to the body's surface. This was the opposite of what happened in cold environments, where vessels constricted to preserve core heat. The increased surface blood flow in the warm bed helped distribute heat more evenly throughout the body, ensuring that even the extremities remained above dangerous temperatures. Sleep itself progressed through its natural cycles, moving from light sleep to deep sleep and back again multiple times through the night. During deep sleep, the body's core temperature dropped by about 1 degree Fahrenheit. This was normal and beneficial, part of the body's strategy for conserving energy. The slight drop in core temperature was easily accommodated by the warm environment of the bed. In a cold environment, this natural temperature drop could be dangerous, but here it was simply part of healthy sleep. The children's bodies worked differently than the adults. With their higher surface area to volume ratio, they lost heat more rapidly per unit of body mass. This was why their positioning in the centre of the family cluster was so important. They benefited from heat radiating from both sides, and their heat losses were minimised by being shielded from the colder edges of the bed. Even so, a child sleeping at the edge of the family group would wake in the morning noticeably cooler than one who had slept in the centre. Throughout these long hours, the family's unconscious collaboration continued. If one person grew slightly cold, they might press closer to another without waking. If the blankets shifted, exposing someone's shoulder or foot, that person would stir slightly and pull the covering back into place. These micro-adjustments happened constantly, maintaining the integrity of the warm system they had created. The family, even in sleep, worked together to survive the night. As sleep deepened and the family settled into stillness, the cottage was not silent. The night had its own soundscape, distinct from the day's noise of activity and conversation. These sounds formed a backdrop to sleep, some soothing, some neutral, occasionally some that might briefly disturb a rest before being absorbed back into the general quiet. The most constant sound was the wind. Outside the cottage walls, the winter wind moved across the landscape, sometimes gusting, sometimes steady, always present. It was a sound that varied in character depending on its strength and direction. A gentle breeze might whisper through the thatch overhead, a soft rustling that was almost peaceful. A stronger wind would howl, a more aggressive sound that tested the walls and shutters, seeking entry. On the coldest nights, when the wind was particularly fierce, it would moan around the corners of the cottage and rattle any loose boards or shutters. The peasants sleeping inside would have been accustomed to this sound. They had heard it every winter night of their lives, and it held no mystery or terror for them. It was simply the voice of winter, a reminder of the world beyond the walls. In some ways, the sound of the wind actually enhanced the sense of safety and warmth inside the cottage. The contrast between the cold, violent wind outside and the warm, still air beneath the blankets made the bed feel even more like a refuge. The thatch roof itself made sounds. As the wind moved across it, the dried reeds or straw would rustle softly. Individual stalks might shift slightly, held in place by the bindings, but still capable of small movements. On nights when snow fell, there would be a different sound, a soft pattering, as snowflakes landed on the thatch, accumulating gradually. This sound was generally quieter than rain, which would drum more audibly on the roof, but it was still perceptible to someone lying awake. Inside the cottage, the animals contributed their own sounds. The chickens, though mostly quiet at night, would occasionally shift in their roost. There might be a brief flutter of wings, a soft cluck, or the rustle of feathers as a bird adjusted its position. These sounds were sporadic and brief, rarely loud enough to wake a sleeper. The pig or calf, if present, made more substantial sounds. Their breathing was audible, a slow rhythmic inhaling and exhaling that could be heard across the small cottage. Occasionally one of these large animals would shift position, and the sound of their body moving against the floor or wall would be more pronounced. A pig might grunt in its sleep, a sound that was brief but distinctive. A calf might make a soft lowing sound, especially if it was young, and still accustomed to calling for its mother. The banked fire produced its own quiet sounds. Even covered with ash, the embers beneath would occasionally settle as the remaining wood burned through and collapsed. This settling would produce a soft crumbling or cracking sound, barely audible but present. Very rarely, if a pocket of moisture remained in a piece of wood, it might produce a faint hiss as it turned to steam and escaped. These fire sounds were intermittent and unpredictable, occurring perhaps once or twice an hour. Within the bed, the family itself made sounds. Breathing was the most constant, the regular rhythm of inhalation and exhalation, multiplied by the number of sleepers. Each person had their own breathing pattern, their own rhythm and depth. When everyone was deeply asleep, these patterns might synchronize somewhat, creating a collective rise and fall. At other times, they remained individual, overlapping and creating a complex audio texture. Snoring was inevitable. Not everyone snored and not every night, but in a family of 5 or 6 or more people, at least one would likely snore on any given night. The father, being larger and often sleeping on his back, was a common culprit. Snoring could range from soft, gentle sounds to louder, more disruptive ones. In the close confines of the shared bed, a loud snorer could disturb the sleep of others, but this was accepted as part of the reality of communal sleeping. There was no separate room to retreat to, no way to escape the sound. One simply endured it or, if awakened by it, perhaps reached over and nudged the snorer to encourage them to shift position. Children made their own sounds in sleep. Young children might whimper or murmur, the sounds of dreams or momentary discomfort. Babies, if present, would wake periodically through the night and cry when hungry or uncomfortable. The mother would respond to these cries, usually without fully waking herself, offering the breast or adjusting the baby's position. This nocturnal caregiving was automatic, practiced over weeks and months until it required no conscious thought. Older children might talk in their sleep, brief phrases or single words that emerged from dreams and then faded back into silence. Sometimes a child might move suddenly, a limb jerking or twitching as the body transitioned between sleep stages. These movements were normal and generally did not wake the child who made them, though they might disturb a sibling lying nearby. The sound of movement against fabric was common. The rough wool of the blankets and the canvas of the palliasse made distinctive sounds when bodies shifted against them. A person turning over in sleep would produce a rustling, sliding sound. A child pulling the blanket up higher would create a soft scraping as the fabric moved across other layers. These sounds were gentle and generally associated with comfort, someone seeking a better position, someone ensuring they remained covered. Occasionally there would be sounds from outside the cottage that penetrated into the interior. An animal in the village might make a sound, a dog barking at something, a cow lowing in a distant barn. These sounds were muffled by the walls and thatch reaching the interior as faint, distant echoes. On a particularly still night, human sounds might carry, someone coughing in a neighbouring cottage, the cry of a baby, the brief sound of a voice. These reminders that other families were also enduring the night, also huddled in their own cottages seeking warmth, created a sense of community, even in the isolation of darkness. The sounds of the night, taken together, created an environment that was never truly silent but was nevertheless conducive to sleep. The sounds were familiar, expected, and mostly gentle. They did not jar or startle. They were the sounds of life continuing, of the cottage and its inhabitants persisting through the cold and dark. For someone raised in this environment, these sounds were deeply associated with safety and rest. They were the sounds of home, of family, of survival being successfully enacted one night at a time. Sleep did not come to everyone at once. It arrived in waves, beginning with the youngest and spreading slowly to the adults who carried the day's burdens. The youngest children were first to drift off. Their small bodies, exhausted from the cold and daily activity, yielded quickly once they were warm beneath the covers. They might stare for a moment at the faint glow of the banked fire before their eyelids grew heavy and closed. Soon their breathing slowed, deep and even in the rhythm of childhood sleep. Infants followed their own rhythm, nursing before drifting off, sometimes waking again during the night. Their mothers stirred instinctively to soothe or feed them before slipping back into shallow rest. Older children took longer. Their bodies were tired, but their minds wandered, replaying the day's events or thinking of tomorrow's chores. Comfort made a difference. A cramped position or lack of warmth could delay sleep. Sharing a bed brought both security and disturbance, comforting closeness, but also the occasional kick, snore, or cry from a sibling. The parents were last to yield. Even in darkness, their thoughts lingered on responsibility. The father might worry about food stores, broken tools, or the next day's labour. The mother thought of the children who coughed, who seemed weak, what needed mending. These worries gradually blurred as fatigue overcame thought. Their breathing deepened, matching the steady rhythm of their sleeping children. Sleep came quietly, almost unnoticed. Awareness faded, replaced by stillness. The only sounds were the sighs of sleepers and the soft whisper of wind outside. The fire glowed faintly beneath its ash covering, keeping a low, steady warmth. Hours passed differently now. The long winter night, 12 or more hours, seemed to compress into a few moments of rest. The body recovered, the mind drifted through dreams. Brief wakings were normal, pulling a blanket closer, checking the baby, or stepping outside to relieve oneself before returning to warmth. Soon sleep reclaimed them. The family lay still beneath the blankets, the room quiet and dark, the fire dim but alive, the fragile warmth of life holding steady against the cold of the medieval night. The hours of the night stretched out, dark and cold and seemingly endless. Outside the cottage, the winter landscape was locked in stillness. The fields lay frozen, the snow on them undisturbed by wind or animal. The sky, if it was clear, would be dense with stars. The Milky Way a bright band across the heavens, far more visible than it would be in later centuries when artificial light would dim the night. If it was cloudy, the darkness would be absolute, unbroken by any glimmer of moon or star. Inside the cottage, time was marked only by subtle changes. The banked fire continued its slow consumption of the remaining wood. The embers glowed beneath their covering of ash, dimming gradually as the night progressed. The heat they produced lessened incrementally, so slowly that the change was not perceptible from one moment to the next. But over the course of hours, the cottage grew colder. The walls, which had held some warmth from the evening's fire, cooled as they radiated heat outward into the frozen night. The temperature inside the cottage, which might have been tolerable in the early evening, dropped to just above freezing, or in the coldest weather, even to freezing itself. The earthen floor grew harder as any residual moisture in it froze. The walls, though providing shelter from the wind, offered little insulation against the deep cold of a winter night. The cottage was a shell, better than being outside but far from truly warm. But within the bed, the family remained warm. The microclimate they had created persisted through the night, maintained by their collective body heat and the insulating layers of wool and hide. As the cottage grew colder, the contrast between the air outside the blankets and the air beneath them became more pronounced. A person sleeping near the edge of the bed, with their shoulder or arm exposed, would feel the cold acutely. They might unconsciously pull that limb back under the covers, seeking the warmth. The family's bodies worked throughout the night to maintain temperature. Metabolism continued, breaking down the calories from the evening meal to produce energy and heat. Blood circulated, carrying warmth from the core to the extremities. The body prioritized the vital organs, the heart, the brain, the liver, ensuring that these remained at the proper temperature even if the fingers and toes grew cold. This was an automatic process, controlled by systems far below conscious awareness, but it was essential to survival. The body's thermal regulation was not perfect. As the night progressed, even beneath the blankets there would be some heat loss. The extremities, fingers and toes, would cool first. They were farthest from the body's core and received less blood flow. Wrapped in cloth and buried beneath blankets, they would remain above dangerous temperatures, but they would not be truly warm. Morning would often bring a tingling or numbness to the feet, a sign that circulation had been reduced during the night. Children with their smaller bodies and higher surface area to volume ratio were more vulnerable to heat loss than adults. This is why they were positioned in the middle of the bed, surrounded by the larger, warmer bodies of their parents. The youngest child, nestled between mother and father, would remain warmest through the night. Older children, positioned at the edges, might wake feeling colder, and they would press closer to a sibling or parent, seeking shared warmth. Sleep itself was not always deep or uninterrupted. The body cycled through different stages of sleep throughout the night, from light sleep to deep sleep and back again, with periods of REM sleep interspersed. During lighter sleep stages, external sounds or physical discomfort might partially rouse a sleeper. They might shift position, adjusting to relieve pressure on hip or shoulder. They might unconsciously pull a blanket up or tuck a hand under their body for warmth. These micro-adjustments happened many times during the night, usually without the person waking fully. Dreams came and went. In the medieval period, dreams were often seen as significant, as messages or portents. The content of dreams was influenced by the experiences and concerns of daily life. Dreams of hunger during times of scarcity, dreams of warmth during winter, dreams of work and family and the constant struggle of existence. Children dreamed of play and stories. Adults dreamed of labour and responsibility. The dreams were as varied as the individuals who experienced them, but they shared the common context of medieval peasant life. The animals in the cottage also slept, though their sleep patterns were different from those of humans. Chickens slept lightly, always alert to potential danger. Their sleep was broken by brief periods of wakefulness, during which they would look around, assess their safety, and then settle back to sleep. The pig or calf, being larger and more secure, slept more deeply. Their breathing was slow and regular, and they might lie still for hours, barely moving. As the night progressed toward morning, the deepest cold of the day would arrive. This typically occurred in the hours just before dawn, when the earth had been radiating heat into the night sky for many hours, and the sun had not yet begun to warm the land. This was the time when the cottage was coldest, when the banked fire had dimmed to its faintest glow, when even the walls themselves seemed to hold no warmth at all. But the family, cocooned in their bed, remained insulated from the worst of this cold. The layers they had so carefully arranged continued to do their work. The wool blankets, compressed by the weight of the sleepers and warmed by their bodies, held heat with remarkable efficiency. The hide on top, acting as a windbreak and vapour barrier, prevented the escape of the warm, humid air beneath. The straw mattress below provided insulation from the cold seeping up from the floor. In this way, the yards. Long hours of the night passed. The family slept, their bodies rested, their energy conserved. The cottage stood firm against the wind and cold. The village around them was equally still, each cottage holding its own family, each family surviving the night in much the same way. The winter night, dark and cold and seemingly eternal, was being endured, 1 hour at a time, 1 breath at a time, one shared moment of warmth at a time. The transition from night to day in winter was gradual and reluctant. Darkness did not lift all at once, but faded slowly, grey light seeping into the world so gradually that it was difficult to say exactly when night ended and day began. The stars faded first, disappearing one by one as the sky above them shifted from black to dark grey to lighter grey. The horizon, if one could see it, would begin to show the faintest hint of light long before the sun itself appeared. Inside the cottage, this transition was even less noticeable. The walls and the shuttered windows admitted almost no light. The interior remained dark long after the world outside had begun to brighten. The only way to know that morning was approaching was by some internal sense of time, or by the faint changes in the quality of the darkness, a barely perceptible shift from the absolute black of deep night to a slightly less absolute black. The cottage at this hour was at its coldest. The banked fire had burned through most of the night, but by dawn the embers beneath the ash were very faint, producing almost no heat. The temperature inside the cottage had dropped throughout the night, and now it was perhaps only a few degrees above the outside temperature. Frost might have formed on the inside of the walls near cracks or gaps. The air was still and frigid, sharp in the lungs if one breathed deeply. The family, however, remained asleep beneath their layers of blankets. The microclimate they had created was still intact, still warm relative to the surrounding air. Their bodies continued to produce heat, and the insulation continued to trap it. In the warmth and darkness, there was no signal to wake, no reason to leave the comfort of the bed. But eventually someone would wake. Often it was the father, whose internal clock and sense of responsibility drove him to consciousness even when his body craved more rest. He would wake gradually, awareness returning in stages. First a vague sense that sleep was ending, then a growing consciousness of his surroundings. The warmth of the bear, the breathing of his family, the weight of the blankets. Finally, full wakefulness, and with it, the knowledge that the night had passed and the day's work awaited. For a few moments, he might lie still, reluctant to move. Beneath the blankets, he was warm. He knew that as soon as he moved, as soon as he pulled the covers back and exposed himself to the cottage's cold air, he would feel the shock of the temperature difference. But the work would not wait. Animals needed to be fed. The fire needed to be revived. Life had to continue, and it was his responsibility to ensure that it did. He would begin to move, slowly and carefully, trying not to disturb the others. He would shift his position, disentangling himself from the pile of bodies. A child sleeping against him might murmur or stir, but usually would not wake fully. He would ease the blankets off himself, feeling the immediate chill as the cold. Air met his skin. Then, moving as quickly as he could manage in the darkness, he would sit up and swing his legs over the edge of the bed. His feet would meet the cold floor, and the sensation would be sharp and unpleasant. The earthen floor would be intensely cold, possibly even frozen. He would reach for whatever footwear was nearby, perhaps the cloth wrappings he had worn to bed, or simple leather shoes left beside the bed. Pulling these on provided some barrier against the cold floor, though they themselves would be cold and would take time to warm from his body heat. Standing was the next challenge. Leaving the horizontal position meant leaving the last vestiges of the bed's warmth. The air in the cottage, though still, was frigid, and it immediately began to draw heat from his body. His breath would be visible, a small cloud that formed with each exhalation and quickly dispersed. He might wrap his arms around himself briefly, a reflexive gesture against the cold, before reaching for the woolen tunic he'd removed the night before. Dressing in the darkness required familiarity with his clothing and his surroundings. He knew where he had left his tunic, knew how to pull it over his head without needing to see. The wool was cold and stiff, and pulling it on provided little immediate warmth, but it was a necessary layer, and within a few minutes his body heat would begin to warm the fabric. He might also reach for a heavier outer garment, a cloak or an additional layer, if the cold was particularly intense. Once dressed, his first task was the fire. Without the fire, the cottage would remain unbearably cold. Without the fire, there would be no hot food, no ability to warm oneself, no centre around which the family's life could organise. Reviving the fire was the most critical task of the early morning, and it required care and skill. He would make his way across the cottage to the hearth, moving carefully in the darkness. The layout was familiar. He had walked this path countless times, but in the absolute dark, even familiar spaces could be treacherous. He might stub a toe on a stool or nearly trip over an animal that had shifted position during the night, but eventually he would reach the hearth and kneel beside it. The cottage at dawn was at its coldest, the banked fire reduced to its faintest glow. The father, the first to wake, moved through the darkness toward the hearth with practiced familiarity. Every step of what followed had been done countless times before. This was the most fundamental skill of household survival, passed from father to son across generations. Kneeling beside the hearth, he began carefully brushing away the ash that had been spread over the coals the night before. The technique required a light touch, clearing enough to expose the embers without smothering them with the displaced ash. He used a stick or his hands, working in the near-total darkness, guided more by feel and experience than by sight. As the ash was pushed aside, the embers revealed themselves. They glowed deep red-orange, faint but alive, pulsing gently with retained heat. This glow was proof that the fire had survived the night. The banking had worked. The household's continuity was maintained. He reached for the kindling he had prepared the night before, small dry twigs and wood shavings that would catch easily. These were placed carefully on and around the glowing embers, arranged to allow air to flow. Fire needs oxygen, and the spacing of the fuel was as important as the fuel itself. Then came the breath. Leaning close to the hearth, he blew steadily across the coals, feeding them oxygen. The embers brightened immediately, their glow intensifying from dim red to brilliant orange. He blew again, a long, controlled exhalation. The kindling began to smoke, thin white wisps rising in the darkness. Another breath and another. The smoke thickened. Then, with a suddenness that was nevertheless expected, a small flame appeared. It flickered at first, barely visible, but it was real fire, actual combustion. He added a few more pieces of kindling slightly larger, and the flame spread, grew, began to establish itself. Within minutes, the fire was alive again. Flames licked upward, casting flickering orange light through the cottage. The transformation was immediate and profound. Where there had been only darkness and cold, there was now light and the promise of warmth. The cottage began to wake with the fire, the long night giving way to another day. This resurrection, repeated every morning throughout the winter, was more than a practical task. It was the central ritual of peasant life, the moment when continuity was proven, when survival was confirmed. The fire had been preserved through the darkness, the family had endured the cold, and now, with the flames rising once more, life could continue. With the fire burning and light spreading through the cottage, the immediate work of morning began. The animals required attention first. They had been confined through the night and now needed care. The chickens, stirring with the light and activity, would begin to cluck and move in their basket. They would be released to wander the cottage floor, where they would search for any fallen grain or scraps, providing a modest form of cleaning while finding their own supplemental food. The larger animals, a calf or pig that had shared the cottage's warmth, required more direct attention. The solid waste they had produced during the night needed to be removed. The father or an older son would use a wooden shovel or flat piece of wood to scoop up the dung, carrying it outside to the midden heap where it would eventually be composted for the fields. The earthen floor where the animals had lain would be damp with urine. This could not be removed, but it could be managed. Fresh straw or dried rushes would be scattered over the wet areas, absorbing moisture and covering the smell. This was not ideal. Over a full winter, the floor would become increasingly soiled, but it was workable. Spring would bring the opportunity to dig out the old floor material and replace it with fresh earth, a task of renewal that marked the changing seasons. The animals would be fed next. A calf needed milk or a grain mixture. The pig would eat scraps and whatever grain the family could spare. The chickens would continue pecking at whatever they found on the floor, supplemented with scattered grain if stores allowed. While the father tended the animals, the mother would begin preparing the morning meal. The pot of pottage from the night before still sat near the hearth. The contents had cooled and thickened overnight, congealing into a solid mass. She would position the pot over the flames and stir the pottage as it warmed, adding water to thin it to a more edible consistency. The reheating process was slow. The thick pottage took time to warm through, and the mother would stir periodically to ensure it heated evenly and did not scorch on the bottom. The smell of warming food began to fill the cottage, mingling with the wood smoke, a familiar morning scent that signalled the household was returning to life. The children would begin to wake as the cottage warmed and the sounds of activity increased. The older children, sensing that morning had come and work awaited, would rouse themselves despite their desire to remain in the bed's warmth. The younger children might resist longer, burrowing deeper into the blankets, but eventually they too would emerge, driven by the hunger or by a parent's gentle insistence. Each child would go through their brief morning routine. Some would step outside briefly despite the cold, preferring to relieve themselves in the open air rather than use the chamber pot. Others would use the pot and then empty it outside afterward. They would pull on their outer garments, the same woolen tunics and wraps they had worn the day before, and make their way to the fire. Water was needed, though its use was minimal in winter. A small amount might be fetched from the well or stream and warmed over the fire in a separate pot or bowl. This warm water would be used for washing faces and hands, a basic gesture toward cleanliness. But water was too precious and too difficult to obtain in winter for extensive washing. The family accepted the dirt and grime that accumulated, knowing that full cleaning would have to wait for warmer weather. By the time the pottage was warm enough to eat, the family would be gathered around the hearth. Wooden bowls would be distributed, and the mother would ladle the thick steaming mixture into each one. The pottage was essentially the same as it had been the night before: grains, vegetables, perhaps a hint of preserved meat, but reheated, it provided the necessary warmth and calories to begin the day. They ate in relative silence, seated on stools or on the floor near the fire, absorbing the warmth and the food simultaneously. The hot pottage raised their internal temperature, providing warmth from within to complement the external warmth of the fire. This combination, warm food and warm environment, made the morning bearable, despite the cold that still dominated most of the cottage. Stale bread, if available, might be torn into chunks and dipped into the pottage to soften it. The bread itself was too hard and dry to eat comfortably otherwise, but soaked in the warm liquid, it became palatable and added substance to the meal. Nothing was wasted. Any pottage left in the pot would be saved for later. Any crumbs would be gathered and used. As the family ate, plans for the day would be discussed, though these conversations were brief and practical. What work needed to be done? Who would do which tasks? Were there any special concerns? A tool that needed urgent repair? An animal that seemed ill? A weather change that might affect the day's work? The morning meal was functional rather than leisurely. There was no tradition of lingering over breakfast, no social ritual that extended the meal beyond its practical purpose. Once the food was consumed, the bowls would be set aside to be cleaned later, and the family would prepare to face the day's demands. The cottage, which had been a night shelter, would now be left for the work that lay outside. The fire would be tended, built up if someone would remain inside, banked if everyone would be away, and the door would be open to the cold grey light of the winter morning. Another night had been survived. Another day would now be lived, and when evening came, the entire cycle would begin again. With the morning meal consumed and the immediate tasks of dawn completed, the family would prepare to face another day. The cottage, which had been a refuge through the night, would now be left behind as the family ventured out into the winter landscape to undertake the work that survival demanded. The day's activities would vary depending on the season within winter itself and on the weather conditions. In the depths of winter, when the ground was frozen solid and snow lay thick on the fields, there was no agricultural work to be done. The fields rested, and in a sense so did the peasants, though rest in this context meant a different kind of labour rather than true leisure. Winter was the season for maintenance and preparation. Tools that had been damaged during the harvest would be repaired. Fences that had deteriorated would be mended, though the frozen ground made some repairs impossible until spring. Wood would be gathered from the forest, a constant and necessary task, as the supply of fuel had to be maintained. Animals would be tended, those few that had survived the autumn slaughter would need daily care, feeding and protection from the cold. Women and older girls might spend much of the day inside the cottage, engaged in textile work. Wool needed to be carded, spun and eventually woven. Clothing needed mending. These tasks could be done near the fire, making them preferable to outdoor work in winter. but they were no less demanding or essential. The family's clothing, blankets, and other textiles were constantly wearing out and needed constant attention. Men and older boys would typically work outside despite the cold. They might cut wood in the forest, carefully selecting fallen branches or coppiced wood according to their Estover rights. They might work on larger construction or repair projects that required strength and tools. They might trap animals for meat or fur, supplementing the family's food supply and providing additional materials for warmth. The day would be short. In the depths of winter, daylight might last only 8 or 9 hours, and the weak winter sun provided little warmth even when it was visible. Work would need to be completed before darkness fell, because working after dark was difficult and dangerous. The rhythm of work in winter was compressed, intense during the limited daylight hours, then subsiding as evening approached. As the afternoon waned and the light began to fade, the family would begin the process of returning to the cottage, of preparing for another night. The cycle that had begun at dawn would come full circle. Animals that had been outside would be brought in. The fire, which might have been tended periodically throughout the day, would be built up again. The evening meal would be prepared, the same pottage or something similar, providing warmth and sustenance. The evening would unfold much as the previous evening had. The family would gather around the hearth. Small tasks would be completed by firelight. Stories might be told, or the family might simply sit in companionable silence, too tired for much conversation. Children would grow drowsy. The fire would be banked. The drafts would be plugged. The animals would settle into their sleeping places. And then, once again, the family would climb into the bed. They would arrange themselves in their accustomed positions. They would pull up the layers of blankets and hides. They would create again the microclimate that would sustain them through the night. The cold would press in from outside, the wind would howl, the darkness would be complete. But inside the cocoon of the bed, there would be warmth and safety, and the knowledge that they had survived another day. This cycle would repeat itself night after night, week after week, throughout the long winter. Each night was a challenge, each morning a small victory. The family endured not through any single dramatic act of survival, but through the accumulation of countless small actions, gathering fuel, maintaining the fire, plugging drafts, sharing warmth. Their survival was communal, cooperative, and deeply rooted in knowledge passed down through generations. The winter would eventually end. Spring would come, bringing longer days, warmer temperatures, and the renewal of agricultural work. The need to huddle together for warmth would diminish. The cottage would no longer need to be sealed so tightly against the cold. The animals could remain outside. Life would become easier in some ways, though it would bring its own challenges and demands. But for now, in the depths of winter, the night was the great challenge, and the family, like countless families and countless cottages across medieval Europe, met that challenge in the same way their ancestors had for generations. They relied on each other, on the warmth of their own bodies, on simple materials, straw, wool, wood, used with intelligence and care. They survived not despite the cold and darkness, but through their understanding of it, their acceptance of it, and their collective determination to endure it. As dawn breaks over the frozen fields and smoke rises once again from cottage roofs across the medieval landscape, we return to our own time. The cottages we have visited exist now only in archaeological remains and historical records. The families who inhabited them, who huddled together through countless winter nights, have long since passed from this world. But their story remains, a testament to human adaptability and resilience. The medieval peasants who survived winter did not see themselves as remarkable. They were simply living, doing what needed to be done, applying the knowledge they had inherited and would pass on to their children. Yet in their quiet endurance, in their practical wisdom, in their willingness to help one another through the hardest season, there is something worth remembering. We live now in a world transformed. Central heating keeps our homes warm at the touch of a button. Insulated walls hold that warmth with an efficiency medieval builders could not have imagined. We sleep alone or with chosen partners in private rooms under down comforters engineered for maximum warmth with minimum weight. We have conquered the cold in ways that would seem magical to those distant ancestors. Yet perhaps we have lost something as well. The forced intimacy of the shared bed, the necessity of cooperation, the deep knowledge of how warmth is created and conserved, the connection to the rhythms of fire and season, these are largely gone from modern life. We are more comfortable, undoubtedly, but perhaps less aware of our fundamental dependence on each other and on the basic elements that sustain life. The medieval winter night was long and cold and dark, but within it, in the small space of a peasant cottage, in the warm cocoon of a family bed, there was life continuing, breath following breath, warmth shared and preserved. The night always ended, the fire was always rekindled, another day always came, and so the story of how medieval peasants survived winter is, ultimately, a story about continuity, about the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, about the power of simple materials used with intelligence and care, about the warmth that can be created when people come together, literally and figuratively, to face the cold. May you rest well, knowing that for countless generations before us, people found warmth in the darkness, safety in shelter, and comfort in the presence of those they loved. The methods have changed, but the essential need remains the same. We all seek warmth, we all need rest, and we all survive, in the end, by caring for one another through the long cold nights.